Father Mark Link tells a story of an old man who collapsed on a busy street in the corner of downtown Brooklyn. Within minutes, an ambulance rushed him to Kings County Hospital. There he kept calling for his son. A nurse found a dog-eared letter in the man's wallet. From it, he learned that his son was a Marine stationed in North Carolina. That night, a Marine showed up at the hospital, and immediately the nurse took him to the old man's bedside. The old man was heavily sedated, so the nurse had to tell him several times, "Your son is here, your son is here." Finally, the old man opened his eyes. He could barely make out his son, but he recognized the Marine uniform. At that point, the son took his father's hand and held it lovingly. For the rest of the night, the Marine sat at the old man's bedside. Occasionally, he patted the man's hand and spoke to him tenderly. Several times, the nurse urged the Marine to take a break and get something to eat or drink, but he refused. Toward dawn, the old man died. When the nurse extended her sympathy to the young Marine, he asked, "Who was that man?" "Wasn't he your father?" the nurse asked. "No, he wasn't," the Marine said. "I'm afraid I never saw him before." "Why didn't you say something?" the nurse said. "I would have," said the Marine, "but I could see that he was too sick to realize I wasn't his son. I could see also that he was slipping away and needed him. I needed to become that son." Today on Father's Day, I invite you to be that son, be that daughter. A lot of times in the midst of our gospel, our readings today, we hear of Job's complaining. We hear of what's wrong. He's had sorrows, he's had losses. But God turns it around and says, "What are you grateful for? What do you remember? Someone has done something for you." St. Paul talks about the love of God impels him. This is why he does what he does, going around and founding new communities and telling about the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, even if it might cost him his life. The love of Christ. Why do you do the things you do? And then there's Jesus. Jesus has been preaching. And he tells the disciples, let's go to the other side. Now, the other side is always to the people who are different, the people who don't know about God. And so he's telling them, let's go so they might know the message. But in the midst of it, that Sea of Galilee can be very tempestuous at times. It could change in a minute. And so Jesus got caught up in the storm. The disciples don't know what to do or where to go, but they wake him up. "Don't you care? We're going to die." But what happens is, he says, "Don't you believe?" God calls us to once again turn to what we believe and to expect marvelous things. What we're called to do is to be able to remember God's love, God's power, God's protection, God's providence in the midst of the everyday. And as Paul says in his letter, not to consider the things of the past. Think of what's new. Maybe Papa was a rolling stone, and maybe Mother got caught up in all sorts of things about what the neighbors thought. But where are you today? What kind of person are you going to be? What kind of person are you going to be as God's child, God's son, God's daughter? And bring the love, the care to other people. There's a lot of people out there who would need somebody to stand by them, whether they're sick, whether they're dying, whether they're poor, whether they're lonely. We can provide a smile. We can provide a phone call, an email, just to be able to say, "I love you," and so does God. We've got a big job, but in Jesus' name, because God has been good to us, let us continue to be that person that God calls us to be.